Today I'm going to be looking at a position where one player has a 7th ranked pawn, but it is blocked from promoting because they have also an 8th ranked rook on the same file. But the rook cannot move out and then let your pawn to promote because your opponent's rook on the same file will be able to grab that pawn. So I'm going to be looking at all the tricks and tips that you can do both as white and black to get the best result for your side. As black, by the way, the best result is to draw, and as white, the best result is to win. So I'll go ahead and break down the best tips that I have for you. The first thing I need to mention are the tricks that white can do with the rook, okay? Because there are two important ideas that you need to stay away from as black that white can do with their rook, okay? So first of all, if black's king was anywhere on this file other than these two squares on the left side and these two on the right side, and I'll explain why. But if your king was on any of these three squares here in the center, what can white do? Well, white can simply go ahead and move their rook here. The idea is if you grab this pawn here, they'll be able to move here, and I'll show you it actually. And then once the king moves anywhere, you'll be able to grab your opponent's rook, and happy days, you'll be able to win the game pretty easily in this position. Okay, and same goes if your king was on any of these two squares. But notice that if your king was either on this square or any of these squares, then your king would be able to move to a location where it can capture back the rook and it will be a draw. Or if it is on this square or this square, obviously it will be able to capture the rook. Or if it's on this square, it would have been able to capture the rook when it first arrived. So notice these three squares are not safe for the black king. Now let's move on to every other non-safe location for the black king because there's so many. Any other non-safe locations, in fact, I'll move this white king even further back, is anywhere on the board other than these four squares. Okay, we already talked about how these squares here are safe for the king for this first tactic, but now I'm going to be introducing a second tactic that you need to also stay away from. If your king was anywhere, for the most part on the board, but really anywhere in the center of the board, kind of in these areas, then you'd be able to look forward as white to doing this very nice idea where you go ahead and you move your rook out, so you allow the pawn to promote, but instead of black being able to capture, black has to deal with this other threat. And a lot of times this idea is very important in chess, and it doesn't always come with a check. Sometimes you move a rook and then you're targeting a queen, so black has to move the queen to not lose the queen. So there's different ideas, but in this case you're actually targeting the king, so not only is it a choice, black has to move the king, and once black moves the king, you can promote, and happy days, you'll win the game easily after this nice trade-off. But same goes if the king, is basically on any square really in the center. The only safe squares are these 6 that I'm highlighting right now, because obviously if the king is on these on the 7th rank, then you wouldn't be able to move the rook out, because if the king was here, for example, let me show you. If the king was here, for example, you wouldn't be able to do this idea because the king will be able to grab the rook, obviously, and then even if you promote, well, the rook would be able to grab the queen. So this wouldn't work. And so the only safe squares are these 4 here and these 2 here. Why are these 2 safe, you may be asking? Because they are indeed, 2 spaces away from the 8th rank, so it is kind of an idea for white to play a move like this, but in this case it wouldn't work because black has this very nice b7 square where it targets both pieces, and so you wouldn't be able to promote, and same thing with here. Okay, so now that we kind of talked about the biggest issues that black may face, so black has to find itself as quickly as possible in these locations, but when black is in one of these locations, how can black stop white from simply, so let's go ahead and move this here. How can black stop from white simply moving the king over to this square here and, doing this idea and just promoting and winning? Well, there is a way to stop it, but you have to be very, very patient, and that's one of the biggest things in this endgame, as black especially. You have to be patient and wait. Okay, so let me kind of show you how you should be going about this. So once the white king moves, and again the white king probably will only move to aim to get into these 4 squares probably, and will eventually get to this square. And like I said, this idea. And notice that, again, you cannot move your king unless you want to move it here, but that's kind of pointless. But you cannot move your king to any of these 3 squares. Like I mentioned, they are not safe for you, and at least one of the ideas that white has will be able to work in each one of those. So you're simply going to just play these kind of non-aggressive, keeping an eye on this file, or this pawn here moves, okay? So whatever you play, just try to play non-aggressive moves. So for example, from here you can play a move like this. White continues moving, you go here, okay? And you just continue this idea up until a certain point. Now, when is that point? Well, that point is when this king is protecting the pawn here, okay? Because the second the king is protecting the pawn, white is free to move the rook to a safe location, as you wouldn't be able to capture the pawn. So the second the king is protecting the pawn, you have to act or do a different move. So let me show you. So here you still, you do the normal moves. And now here, white is protecting the pawn. White is preparing to play, any of these moves here. You have to play something different. You cannot continue this as what I just showed you will happen. So you're just going to check your opponent. Simple. If your opponent moves here, for example, you check your opponent. And, if your opponent moves back, then you continue checking him. So in review, as long as the king has an eye on this pawn, you need to continue giving checks until the king moves away from the pawn, and then go back to the A file. That is how you can draw this position as black, and drawing is the best result. You have realistically no way to win if white has any sense of how to play chess. Now let me go ahead and show you what can happen if you make a wrong move. A wrong move in this scenario, by the way, would be moving the rook anywhere, but let's say here, for example. Because now you allow this move, and sure, you can continue giving checks and stuff, but eventually the king will be able to come and stop you from giving more checks anywhere, and you'd have to go back here and then promote. You can take it, but I mean, a rook and a king against the king will always win. Hopefully now you've learned a couple of things. First, as white, you've learned the 2 tricks that you have for your rook. The first one being the fact that you can always from this location play this move, and then check your opponent's king and then promote, or you can always wrap around if they're in one of these 3 central locations, and then go ahead and check your opponent and win their rook. So hopefully, you've learned these tricks as white, and as black, you've learned how to avoid these little tricks that your opponent might have, and how to draw the game. Thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure you leave in the comments any videos, ideas that you have for me, for what you want to see in future videos. Subscribe if you're new around here, and I'll see you guys in the next video.